Chanda's mother often went to the driver's house to confide in Chan until strange vibrations began to occur in the woman's heart. Her hands began to idly grope the driver's bottom while complaining about how her husband had no passion for making his wife happy in bed. Hey there! Welcome back to our channel. Today, we're diving into another real-life story that'll make you think twice about the world around us. This one takes us to Luang Prabang, Laos, where a once peaceful family fell apart due to infidelity. But it doesn't stop there. Things took an even darker turn with a tangled and secretive relationship involving the employer and two of his drivers. What really happened in this case? Let's get into the full story and find out. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and share this with your friends. The more, the merrier. Alright, here's how the story goes. Meet Supan, a man born in 1971. He became a civil servant at the age of 26 and worked for many years at the Civil Registry Office in Luang Prabang, Laos. In 1999, he married, but unfortunately, things didn't go as planned. The marriage only lasted 3 years because they both felt they weren't right for each other. Some rumors even spread that Supan was infertile, while his wife's family was eager for children. Others claimed his wife was unfaithful, and there were even whispers that Supan had a drinking problem and liked to flirt with other women. After the divorce, Supan worked hard to clear his name and make sure the community didn't think poorly of him. "The truth is, we just grew apart," he explained. Fast forward to 2008, when Supan, now 37, was on the verge of marrying again. But this time, his future wife turned out to be a scam artist. She took the proposal money, all the reception funds, his credit cards, and even his car. To make things worse, she disappeared without a trace. At that time, Supan was deeply in love with her. She was 14 years younger than him, but this betrayal left him heartbroken and traumatized. That is, until he met Chanda. Chanda worked as an honorary employee at the office where Supan was stationed, and they soon became close. They got engaged, and by 2011, when Supan was 40 and Chanda was 35, they tied the knot. One of their biggest hopes for their marriage was to have children. But years passed, and Chanda didn't show any signs of pregnancy. A visit to the doctor revealed that both of them were perfectly healthy, but it seemed they just weren't destined to have biological children. This led them to a decision. They applied to adopt a child, someone to care for them as they grew older. After all, what good is wealth and a big house without children to share it with? They didn't need to be biological parents. In August 2016, their wish was granted, and they adopted a child, raising him as their own. Then, in 2017, Sufan's life took another step forward. He officially became the deputy regent of the outskirts of Luang Prabang. With a family, a new role, and a bright future ahead, it seemed that Supan had finally found the peace and fulfillment he had been searching for all along. Mrs. Chanda and her little family often give off this vibe of total harmony and happiness. People are always praising them, and it's easy to see why. They've got this warm, loving atmosphere that radiates through their home. And the best part? No one even knows that their child is adopted unless someone asks. The bond between them is so genuine and strong, it's impossible to tell the difference. Mr. Supan, known for his kindness and generosity, also owns a palm oil business in the area, so money is never an issue for him. He could retire at any time if he wanted to. But instead, he's always there for people, helping out whenever anyone comes knocking on his door. Whether it's a friend in need or someone from the community, Mr. Supan does his best to lend a hand. Meanwhile, Mrs. Chanda is busy with various social activities while still taking care of their son, with the help of a household assistant. Then, in June 2019, a man named Sambat, 27 years old, came to Mr. Supan asking for a job. He had been out of work for almost a year after losing his previous job. Sambat had worked as a fisherman and in a plantation, but those jobs didn't stick. He had a daughter, and his wife, Malai, was constantly nagging him about being unemployed. Malai sold clothes online, but her income was pretty modest. She was also the type who liked to hang out with her friends, not fully satisfied with her life, especially since she had married young and was yearning for a more carefree, hedonistic lifestyle. Sambat, on the other hand, felt embarrassed. He hated staying at home without work, especially as his daughter was growing up and needed money for school. He turned to Mr. Suphan, hoping there might be a job available. "Anything really," he pleaded, "as long as there's a paycheck." The deputy regent had to explain that there were no open positions. He had already filled all the spots. But after discussing it with his wife, Suphan decided to offer Sambat a backup personal driver position. Why backup? Because Suphan already had a regular driver and assistant named Chan, who was 30 years old and had been with him for 4 years. Chan, who's married with kids, didn't mind the idea at all. He was happy to help out, knowing it would give Sambat some financial relief. On days when Chan didn't need to drive, Sambat would step in to assist. He also helped around the house with things like gardening or keeping an eye on things when he wasn't behind the wheel. By September 2019, after 3 months of working as a backup driver, Sambat's life took another turn. Mr. Suphan began traveling more often for out-of-town assignments in Muangze. These trips were all about social and health projects in collaboration with hospitals from Luang Prabang, including building new health facilities. These trips kept Suphan away from his family for long stretches. As a result, Mrs. Chanda had to step in and temporarily take over some of her husband's duties, like meeting with community leaders in Luang Prabang. Suphan hadn't been home for a whole month. Whenever his wife tried reaching out to him, whether through a call or a chat, he'd snap at her, his patience clearly running thin. At 48, and Chanda being 43, it wasn't unusual for the tension between them to boil over now and then, especially after long, exhausting days at work. But the constant irritation was starting to wear on both of them. Chanda tried to be understanding, recognizing how tough their jobs were, but there was no reason for the harshness to spill over into their relationship. This growing tension made Chanda uneasy. She had heard rumors about her husband being involved in some shady dealings with project funds alongside a colleague at the district office. Though there was no hard proof, Suphan kept working as usual. The fear still lingered in her heart. It was always there, gnawing at her, and when he was away, she found herself confiding more and more in Chan's driver, a man who had secretly been her boyfriend for quite some time. She enjoyed his company, often chatting with him and letting him in. For context, Chan and Sambat didn't live in the main house. They lived in a smaller house that Suphan owned, just 150 meters away. It was known as the driver's house, mostly because it had been left empty, so they decided to let Chan and Sambat stay there. It also served as a place to park their cars. Once a week, they'd go back to the main house to see their children and wives, following an agreement they had made. Well, Chanda's mother often went to the driver's house to confide in Chan until strange vibrations began to occur in the woman's heart. Her hands began to idly grope the driver's bottom while continuing to complain about how her husband had no more passion in making his wife happy in bed. Because Sambat was being told to help clean up in the main house, Chan finally agreed to serve his employer's wife so that she wouldn't be too upset, he said. They didn't do it in the living room or bedroom because there were surveillance cameras, but on a leather sofa in the car garage because there were no surveillance cameras. For Chan, impressing his bosses is a major obligation. He earned a salary from them, so he couldn't refuse when invited by Ms. Chanda to be the woman's desire fulfiller. Moreover, some of the meetings that Mrs. Chanda participated in to replace her husband's duties made her even closer to Chan, who drove her everywhere. Anyway, the two of them became even more intimate when no one was looking. On the evening of November 1, 2019, after Mrs. Chanda had just finished her intimate time with Chan, she noticed a shadow lurking at the garage door. A moment later, she spotted Sambat, who quickly hid, likely out of fear of getting caught spying on them. The next morning, Sambat was summoned to the main house and questioned about what he had seen the night before. He was told to admit to it and not play dumb, or else he'd lose his job if he made any trouble or told anyone about it. Feeling cornered, Sambat apologized and promised to keep it a secret. But even after Mrs. Chanda pressed him further, he eventually admitted that this wasn't the first time he had accidentally peeped. Worried he might spill the beans, Mrs. Chanda decided to pay a visit to Sambat's house while her husband was away, hoping to make him do something he clearly didn't want to. Sambat refused, but Mrs. Chanda threw around a few threats, including that he'd be fired, which ultimately pressured him into giving in to her demands. To add to the situation, she played on his sympathy, telling him that her husband hadn't been home in nearly 2 months, leaving her feeling lonely. This made Sambat feel for her and, wanting to help her feel better, he reluctantly agreed to go along with it. What followed were a series of encounters in the garage, which happened several times. On November 14, 2019, Mr. Suppan came home to find himself caught in a heated argument with his wife in their bedroom. According to their household assistant, things got pretty intense, with words like divorce, division of property, and depression thrown around. Despite the tension, Mr. Suppan had come back with a lot of special gifts for his 7-year-old son, and also gifts for Chan and his family. He even brought jewelry for Sambat to give to his wife, along with other surprises. For some reason, Sambat was really touched by the gesture. It was clear he had never received anything like that before, and it meant a lot to him. To top it off, Mr. Suppan even handed over extra money to help cover his daughter's school fees. Sambat was so moved that he cried, hugging his employer in gratitude. The next morning, as she drove Mr. Suppan to work, Sambat couldn't hold it in anymore. She confessed something heavy. While Mr. Suppan had been away for almost 2 months, Mrs. Chanda had repeatedly hooked up with Chan and even invited herself to get her own needs met. Sambat apologized, feeling guilty for betraying her boss, especially after everything he had done for him. Mr. Suppan may have been shocked, but he didn't show it. He actually seemed to take it in stride, thinking his employee was just too innocent for his own good. As for his wife, he was less forgiving. He saw her as someone who had taken advantage of the situation. Mr. Suppan then whispered something to Sambat, telling him to do something to balance the scales, to make up for the mistake so that there would be no bad blood going forward. Later that night, around 11:30 p.m., Mrs. Chanda received a message from Sambat, asking her to meet him in the garage of the driver's house for a quick rendezvous. She noticed that Mr. Suppan was already asleep, so she decided to make her way over. When she got there, though, Chan wasn't around. He had been told to stay at the district head's office, so Sambat was alone. As they met in the garage, things took a dark turn. Sambat, who had come prepared, attacked her with a machete, repeatedly striking until he was sure she was dead. Afterward, he fled the scene, heading straight to the nearest police station to turn himself in. 2 hours later, there was a loud knock on the door of the main house. When the gardener answered it, the police stormed in and rushed straight to Mr. Suppan's room, where they arrested him, clearly catching him off guard. Outside, the scene was chaotic, with emergency vehicles and an ambulance parked nearby. The police quickly briefed everyone on the situation. It turned out that Mr. Suppan had been secretly seeing another woman in the Muangze area. He had used the excuse of working on health facility projects out of town as a cover for his frequent absences. Mrs. Chanda had found out about the affair from a trusted source, even getting her hands on photos of her husband's intimate moments with this other woman. That's when the argument erupted. The household assistant overheard it, and during the fight, the couple considered divorce. However, Mr. Suppan wanted to wait until his term ended, fearing the embarrassment it would bring. They both agreed to hold off, mainly to protect the feelings of their adopted child. But things took a different turn when Sambat learned about his wife's secret rendezvous with the two drivers. He felt a surge of jealousy and anger. He also started to believe that Mrs. Chanda wasn't as perfect as he had imagined her to be. Meanwhile, he saw an opportunity to break away and marry his mistress. After Sambat apologized for his actions, Mr. Suppan, sensing an opportunity to deal with the situation, manipulated his driver's guilt. He convinced Sambat to make amends by taking care of Mrs. Chanda once and for all, and then fleeing town. There, Sambat would have his needs met and be offered a new job. The driver agreed, even planning for Chan to stay at the office that night under the guise of various work-related reasons. But in the end, Sambat didn't follow through on the plan as instructed. After killing Mrs. Chanda, instead of fleeing, Sambat made the unexpected decision to turn himself in to the authorities. His reason? He was filled with regret and fear of God. He didn't hold anything back. He openly told the police who had ordered him to do it, even providing evidence in the form of chats and phone calls from his employer. When officers found Mrs. Chanda's lifeless body at the driver's house, they quickly moved in and arrested Mr. Suppan. With all the evidence stacked against him, he was left with nowhere to go. At first, Mr. Suppan denied everything, but after speaking with his lawyer and realizing how severe the punishment could be, he eventually confessed the truth. He explained that, despite having a mostly good relationship with his wife, things had gotten rocky. Mrs. Chanda had her issues and a lot of pretentious behavior. On top of that, he had fallen in love with another woman. As if that wasn't bad enough, his wife had started sleeping with the drivers, making the situation even worse. When the trial began in early 2020, Mr. Suphan, who had already been fired from his position, took the stand and made a shocking statement. He asked the court to release Sambat, claiming that his driver should not be held accountable for the crime. According to Suphan, Sambat had no reason to kill his wife other than following his orders. "Poor guy," he said. He was too innocent to refuse. However, the prosecutor made it clear that the legal process had to continue as planned. The law couldn't simply overlook the gravity of the situation. On April 15, 2020, the judges at the Luang Prabang Municipal High Court found 49-year-old Suphan guilty of orchestrating his wife's death. He was sentenced to life in prison. Meanwhile, Sambat was sentenced to 15 years for assaulting Mrs. Chanda, which ultimately led to her death. Afterward, Suphan's adopted son was taken in by his younger brother, who lived in Muang Zay. As for Chan, who also admitted to his involvement with Mrs. Chanda, he was initially charged with misconduct. But after the court considered that he had merely followed his employer's invitation, he was acquitted of all charges. What do you think? What lessons can we learn from this story?